Understanding composition. So let's start with the dictionary.com definition of what composition is. So it talks about the act of combining parts or elements to form a whole, the resulting state or product, manner of being composed, structure. This painting has an orderly composition. So I definitely think about the different elements that are going to be on the page and how those are put together, and that forms your final image. So I probably gravitate more towards the top definition of this as we get into this more. Also, composition is a tool that leads the eye. So composition is another tool that we have as artists to lead the eye of the viewer where we want them to go. It is possible, just like with shape language and lighting, we can influence the mood or emotional state of the viewer. So again, it's just another tool that we have at our disposal to guide the viewer where we want them to focus, where we want them to look at. And we're going to look at some different rules on what is considered good composition. So before we get started on composition, let's just rewind back and take a look at the different tools that we've looked at already. So we've looked at basic shapes, and that can inform the viewer's feelings and emotional states based off of the shapes that we use. We have the circular shapes that can be more safe, more inviting. Square is going to be more stable for us. And then the triangle shapes could be something that maybe you use on a villain, or you think of danger, or maybe sharpness or angularity, right? Then we looked at silhouettes. And silhouettes are really those combination of basic shapes, and those are our first reads. Those are the things that we gravitate towards instantly, and makes things a whole lot more recognizable at just a glance. And then from there, we learned about value and contrast, and how value we are able to, if you take the left side of this character here, we can get to value separation from our different parts, and then the value can make sure that we distinguish maybe armor from skin and things like that. But then also with contrast and lighting direction, we can also focus the viewer's eye in a particular area. So again, that becomes a tool that we use. And in here, we looked at the Dota 2 example and how they use gradients. And if you use a darker gradient towards the bottom of the character, we can lift the eye up in this area based off of where the light falls on that particular character. And then we took a look at basic lighting as a way to define pretty simple lighting setup. So we've got a main directional shadow casting light, then we've got some bounce light, and then a rim light. We also looked at the ways that changing just the lighting direction, how that can affect mood as well. And also lighting helps you to focus on a particular area and where do you want the viewer to look. So again, those are all tools at our disposal to help inform and guide the viewer's eye. So now talking about composition, I put together this cheat sheet that you see here that could help with this. So I've put horizontal layouts and vertical layouts, and what we're going to be taking a look at is these different composition types. So we've got the rules of thirds, circular, triangle, or pyramid. There should be a radii, and then we've got a cross, L, rectangle, or iconic. Okay. Before we go too far into this talk, I just wanted to point out that most of the information on here, and I'm going to try to call this out, came from an artist by the name of Phil Straub. I had the pleasure of working with Phil at EA for a certain amount of time, and really talented concept artist. Did a lot of designs for Disney before he worked at EA. Then after EA, he's worked on quite a few numerous projects and working for different game companies and entertainment companies as well. And so the rules of thirds. So when you take the canvas and you divide it into thirds, horizontally and vertically, where the lines cross in the picture areas is the golden mean, or the best spot in which to place your main subjects or object of interest, as it is the focal point of your picture. And so I just put this grid together and put these little circular dots to kind of show you that the idea is if you put your subject matter in these quadrants, it's going to gain your attention and focus in on those areas a bit stronger. So you might even order them in order of importance, and you might say that this is primary, secondary, maybe tertiary. So it's really up to you how you build that combination of things. But again, the idea is that you put those those subjects in those areas, and it becomes pretty strong. Now, some of these images came from that presentation that Phil put together, and some of the images I do believe that he actually made imagery that lined up really good for what he was talking about for these different composition types. Like you can see here on this image, this is the focal point of this tower, and there's also this maybe flying dove that falls in another area of rules of thirds on here. And then I thought it might be interesting to take a look at other mediums as well. So we've got Travis Charest from really good comic book illustrator. This is a still frame for the movie Aliens, and then this is a still frame from Blade Runner. But hopefully you can see how some of the subject matter falls within the areas of rules of thirds for these. Okay, so the background image that I chose from this is by an artist by the name of Sparth. And I did find it interesting that just even putting this grid down, sometimes it lines up fairly well, and it doesn't have to fall directly right on this spot where you're looking. But you can see on this image, it looks, it does have the rules of thirds. We do have this big subject that we have here, this flying ship. But I think also with the use of lighting and contrast, we've got this area here that my eye is just drawn into this particular area and this shot on here. And again, this character is probably like a secondary element within here. Now, it doesn't have to fall directly right within that line, but you can see it's pushed over here a little bit. But it does feel to me like the heaviest part of this image falls within this range right here, like this. So the next composition type, if we take a look at circular. So circular is made up of continuous curve, and as circular movement keeps the eye in the picture frame. There are many circles in nature and man-made objects. Again, that's from Phil Straub. This one, if it's laid out like this, you can see this guide, it does look like a target. And yeah, if you just maybe want to think of it in that capacity where you want to, where do you want the viewer to look at? Maybe that's the bullseye of this target, right? But as we look at radii a little bit later, I did notice that a lot of students get circular mixed up with radii. For this one, just always think of these concentric rings that go out, and maybe they're going to draw your eye into the frame, or they're going to lead you out of the frame. But they're going to be using the shape of circles. And then when we get to radii, those are going to be lines, right? Again, so these are some images that Phil produced for this, and I think it's just, a super obvious example of how you can do these concentric rings and then pull the viewer's eye in to go into this space, and it does feel like a one-point perspective as well, as everything emanates and goes into this one point. This one obviously has got this this train, and it's coming out of those circular rings that you have there. So again, we can either lead the viewer's eye out, or we can go and lead the viewer's eye in at that point. And here's an image that I found too, where I do think it's got a very strong one-point perspective. Everything's leading you to this point of this troll down here at the backside. I wouldn't say these are concentric rings, but you could think of these as maybe squares that go back into space as well. And it all leads you to this point. They're also using the lighting technique where we looked at silhouettes, and this produces a really strong silhouette. We have a backlit character, but then we also have these God rays that come out. And so as we start to talk about radii a little bit later for rays or lines that emanate, this image does have a mixture of elements. So a composition could have a mixture of these different techniques, so don't think that you can't just have one or the other. I thought this was another really good example of concept art. And when I first looked at this image, I actually thought that maybe it was a 3D render, but maybe it looks like a combination of photo bashing together with other things. But this is just like a really great example of how these different levels and these rings can still lead your eye and make you want to go to at least look at a particular spot on the image. And here's some other images that we see from nature, but then also using elements from nature that are man-made, and how your eye is drawn into those different spaces. Okay, the next one that we'll take a look at is the triangle or pyramid. So this is a solid base and will show stability. It also has height and strength. The pyramids of Egypt have survived for thousands of years, while other types of solid buildings have crumbled into the dust in less time. And so, if we want to look at the pyramids, I think that's going to be a very simple image to take a look at. But there's no reason why we can't manipulate these triangular shapes. If we flip them upside down, it will produce something that feels uneasy or uneven. And you can see here's an image from Phil that he produced, that he did that exact thing where he flipped the triangles upside down. Obviously there's this explosion happening, there's a lot of chaos and instability at that point, versus the other direction would give us some stability. You might also see this triangle composition in a lot of maybe portraits. This is a poster by Drew Struzan that you can see that has maybe a hierarchy that you're looking at here, and order of importance, at least for the subject matter. So size plays a role into that. So size, a hierarchy, but then also just this shape of this triangle within here. Could also say something about power and dominance, and it could just also just be an appealing layout for just a still image as well. So here's a pretty obvious example of just seeing what those shapes look like. Man-made objects, and we have some more man-made objects that I thought it was pretty interesting. These suspension bridges, they do have triangular shapes within here, and we have them upside down as well, but then we also have these triangular shapes here. Just creates something a very appealing looking design. And then we have triangle shapes that we see here, or pyramid shapes in nature as well. Okay, here's the one that I was talking about that maybe was confusing people a little bit. So the radii is connection of lines. So just think of lines in this one. Meeting in the center and an expansion of lines leaving the center. The radii is usually found in nature subjects. The best example of the man-made radii is the spoke of a wheel. The eye has two ways to go when it comes upon the radii. It can either be drawn into the picture area or it can be let out of the picture area. You must be careful how you use radii and try to have the eye led into the picture, says Phil Straub. And so in here I chose an artist, John Berkey, and maybe some of the images are maybe not the best example of this, but I just really enjoy his work quite a bit. There is quite a bit of energy and motion to his work. I also think people like Sparth have probably been influenced by this artist in some way, somehow. Yeah, and so I think, again, these examples of your eye being led in by some of this different line work and flowing into these particular spots on here. This one, again, is not quite as obvious, but there's this power and this that emanates from this ship and goes in this direction. We also have angles for the way that the ship comes out at the viewer, but it feels like all these lines, if we take them back, it leads us into this spot within the image. Same thing for this one if we follow some of these shapes out as well. So I think you could also find this again in nature, and if you had something like God rays or something like that, I think that's a pretty easy way for you to follow this. Now it can, if you follow it this direction, it's going to lead you out here, but I think you're probably going to go this direction, and it leads you down to maybe what the subject is down here for this human character, and then same thing for this one, some type of maybe some magical tree. The other thing that I see this a lot used in is comic books, and so usually it's if there's some character that they're trying to draw your attention into their face and they're surprised or something like that, or maybe there was some piece of combat or action and maybe some power source emanating from a central part. Here's some other examples, and this is by Drew Struzan. Both these posters are, and you can see from the thing you're going to be drawn right into the center of where the face would be for this. And on an ET, we've got these different lines that are emanating and then going to maybe the center of the ship. This one's a little bit different. This is from an illustration from the movie The Fifth Element. And we do have these lines that could draw you up to the top of the ship if you follow that. But then we also have just this circular composition type too, so it's got both types within there as well. And just through the wheel with the spoke on there, just to remind us that that's a possibility for bringing us into the center of the image with the wheel there. All right, the next composition type that we'll take a look at is the cross. And it's a showing of opposite force that will give the picture a feeling of cohesion and relationship. The horizontal bar of the cross will act as a stopper, while the vertical pole can act as a leading line. The windows in a large skyscraper will form crosses and will keep your interest in the building. The cross also has religious meanings, and the subtle use of the cross can give hidden significance to an image. And you can see some different images pulled out for this. So again, having some strong vertical component to it and maybe a horizontal component, which Phil considered this like a stopper. And you can see on this image how you've got the horde in the background, and basically you go to the top of that, and that produces this horizontal component, and then you have this very strong vertical component with the figure here. This is an artist by the name of Boris Vallejo, and he's well known for his human illustrations, along with high fantasy and dragons and mythical creatures and things like that. But I did think it was a pretty interesting image. This is basically an inverted cross at this point, and we do have a very strong horizontal component to it and a very strong vertical component as well. This is an artist by the name of Brome, and really fun illustrator to take a look at. If you see in this image, I think again we've got a very strong vertical component leading all the way up to maybe the top of the face and the helmet that you have here. It's got a very strong silhouette as well. But I think it's another example of having a pretty strong vertical and horizontal component within that same image. Here's another image by Sparth. And I thought it was pretty interesting that this could still apply to man-made mechanical objects, even futuristic design as well. So again, very strong vertical component, and then we've got a horizontal component too that matches. So the next composition type that we'll take a look at is L, the L composition. So this makes an attractive frame. It can be used to accentuate important subjects. Many times it's a frame within a frame. A tree with an overhanging branch at the right side of the picture area will form a rectangle and helps frame the main subject in the picture. By doing this, you will make the center of interest stand out and be noticed clearly. And you can see here's some examples of L composition, and we've got very strong shapes off to the right that move across to the left here on this image, and this one is the opposite of that within through here. This is an artist by the name of Jim Murray that I really enjoy his work quite a bit, but you can see that I think you can even stage it with characters and how they move across the screen. Now this might be more powerful of an L composition if maybe there was another character a little bit further back, but I think it still works in that capacity. And you can see here on these environmental pieces how we've got a really strong shape off to both the left side of these things. Also, if we think about the rules of thirds on here, there are some interesting shapes or objects that are off in the distance that fall in that rules of thirds as well. So again, remember, it's possible that you could mix those elements together. I think same thing for this image. What I like about both of these images is I think they set up a very clear foreground, midground, and background. Like on this image here, you can see we could pull out this whole shape together, and we've got a really nice foreground. Then we see some midground elements on here, and I would probably consider this maybe being in the midground as well. And then the background elements are these more nebulous like looking shapes and things like that, and pushed back with atmospheric depth. And then we have the same thing over here where we've got a very clear shape that's in the foreground right here. And maybe even consider this like extreme foreground where you got something that's a whole lot closer to the camera. And so we've at least got a foreground, midground, and a background on each one of those images. And so here's another image that comes from the movie Predator, and I think this is maybe a possibility for an interesting look at L composition from a frame from a film. So iconic. Some art theorists contend that the most important information in the image should be placed near the center of the picture plane. This seems to be confusing to some students since this contradicts many of the major principles of the Golden Rule. In general, iconic composition should and can be used to describe a subject in a certain way. Iconic composition for formal subdivision applies best to subjects of dignified or religious nature. This style of composition was the approach of choice in earlier times, and many excellent compositions have been made with it. Usually, iconic compositions is used to describe symbolic subjects, heroic subjects, or religious subjects. Again, that's from Phil. And this image over here was actually an image of Phil's that he put together for this, and maybe they're talking about in past times that this would be a technique that was pretty important for doing portraits, people of significance. And again, I don't know if you could consider this like a spiritual image or something like that. It feels almost like an angelic type of figure. But I also picked out, this is an artist by the name of J. Scott Campbell. I did find it interesting that how this image fell within through here, at least how the subject matter in the background and then the foreground, how they fall within these areas and then fall within there. And then I took a look at some of these images that have been produced. I'm pretty sure everybody recognizes this image in the center, but how that can still be applied to, if we remove the lettering part of here, how these faces fall within through there. And here's another J. Scott Campbell image, and again talking about heroic subject matter. I seriously doubt that J. Scott Campbell had this composition type in mind whenever he laid it out, but I did find it interesting how, if you put that grid against here, the line of action for the character, the front leg and then the back leg, how they follow these angles, and how this movement up here follows this angle here with the arm, and then this arm follows this angle as well. So just pretty interesting to see how some of those stronger illustrations that you might find start to break them apart. And with these different guides, you could potentially draw these guides and then take a look for yourself and start to identify these different composition types and strong images that you see.